right, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about elaboration, which is not necessarily one specific technique, but kind of a series of different techniques that you can use to kind of dig deeper when you're trying to learn content and kind of make connections to see the bigger picture of how different concepts relate to each other. So I've talked about this in earlier videos, that sometimes we think of our brain like a sponge, right? That if we expose it to information, it'll just kind of get soaked up and we'll have access to it, right, moving forward. And that's a really poor analogy, right? Because our brain really isn't like that. We really need to be able to kind of mentally wrestle with information and concepts in order for them to stick. So that involves things like questioning, trying to make connections, if we're learning something new, trying to take that new information and connect it to what we may already know, or trying to take new information and connect it to our own experiences or other content that's been covered in a course, or maybe content from other courses that we're taking at the same time. So again, we really need to work to make some of these connections and really dig deep in order for us to have any chance of developing the kind of meaningful learning that we're looking for. And that's really what elaboration is about, right? It's working to build upon our understanding by questioning, making connections, things of those nature. And again, it promotes stronger memories and also helps us see the bigger picture. And I think just in general, taking more of a curious approach helps promote learning, right? And that's like things like questioning. Instead of just reading information, right, and trying to kind of process it at a very superficial level and hoping it sticks, start to question, why might this be the case? Does this differ from what I've experienced, or is this different from what I've learned in other courses? Or how do these two concepts, are they alike? How are they differ? Those kinds of things. Like, that's going to give you a much richer understanding of what you're trying to learn than, again, processing something at a very superficial level. And that's what we're really talking about in terms of elaboration. So just to give you an example of how elaboration has been studied and its effects kind of in the science of learning, a study by Smith examined how questioning while reading impacts learning, right? And I'm sure you've all been there when you try to read some kind of assigned passages from a class or chapters, where your mind or your eyes just kind of move from word to word, right? And the words just kind of, breeze through your mind in and out, right? They don't really ever stick. And so, an elaboration technique like this of pausing every once in a while to start asking questions that really try to connect what you're reading to what you may already know, and try to help to further your understanding and process information at a higher level, so that it might actually be able to stick, right? You might be able to actually retain some of what you read. So Smith and her colleagues wanted to really explore that. So she had students read a physiology text, kind of a challenging physiology text. These were undergraduate students, and she differentiated them into a control group or an experimental group. And the control group read the passages twice, right? So they'd read through it, start to finish, then they'd go back to the beginning, read through it, right? Analogous to looking at your notes twice, right? The experimental group only read the passages once, but there were questions posed throughout the reading that the student was asked to pause and consider, right? So it's, again, pushing them not to kind of mindlessly read, but to stop and think about, again, why might this be true? Or when in some passages it would be the student read with the intention of asking or answering a question, those types of things. So again, just kind of sprinkling questions throughout to kind of avoid that kind of mindless reading, and to facilitate a deeper processing of the information the students were trying to retain, right? So they did a post-test where they, tested the students on what they had just read. And again, the experimental group performed quite a bit better than the control group, even though they had only read the material once, right? The other students had gone through it 2 times, but they performed substantially worse on this test of their knowledge of what they had just read. So again, shows us that those pauses to kind of stop and process the information are going to lead to stronger learning outcomes than even reading through it multiple times, reading through the passages. It's not necessarily how often or how much we're exposed to information, it's how deeply we attempt to process that information is essentially one of my key takeaways from this interesting study. So a few different elaboration techniques. We're just going to go through these pretty quick. But the first one I'd like to highlight is elaborative interrogation. And that's really what we just mentioned, or I just mentioned in Smith's study, was questioning as you read and review, right? It's kind of interrogating your reading or interrogating your notes, asking questions throughout, right? So it may be things like, as you're reading, maybe you're reading for an anatomy or physiology class and you're reading about structure of arteries and veins, right? You're reading a paragraph about, how veins are structured and how arteries are structured. And maybe you read, veins have valves. And then you're like, you could just kind of breeze through that and say, okay, I'm going to make a note of that, veins have valves. Or you could stop and say, why would veins have valves? What would be the purpose of valves? What do I already know about the functioning of the cardiovascular system and how blood flows, right? And how the heart pumps blood out to the extremities. What do I know about the functioning of valves? And then can I connect those two and say, why would valves maybe be necessary, right? When we're talking about veins. And then maybe you read the next passage and it talks about arteries and you're like, well, arteries don't appear to have veins. Why would arteries don't appear to have valves? Why would veins have valves but arteries wouldn't? What do I know about the differences in how blood flows and their different functions within the cardiovascular system, right? So again, it's going to push you to think about things at a much deeper level than if you just read through. And same thing with your notes. As you read your notes, go through and don't just kind of go through them and hope that, if you pass through them enough times, that information, just because your brain's exposed to it, is going to get sucked up, right? Like the sponge analogy, right? Again, you're really going to have to mentally wrestle with this information by trying to poke holes in what you're reading and trying to think about why that might be true, right? So that elaborative interrogation technique, I'm going to bring that up again when I talk about effective reading, kind of active reading strategies, because again, this is a very effective way to improve your reading comprehension and your retention. Also works, again, like I said, for notes, even videos, right? Pause and ask questions throughout. Concept mapping is another great approach. I'm not going to go into details. There's a lot of different resources you can use to learn concept mapping, but on the right, I have kind of an example of a concept map that really gives an overview of the inflammatory process. So you can see inflammation and then all the different processes and different things that are involved in inflammation, right? And so a concept map is really, what they'll do is they'll create boxes, or they'll call them nodes, right? That, reflect different concepts or different aspects of some kind of process. And then they'll use linking verbs and arrows to kind of show how they relate, right? So you can see here that goes through this whole inflammatory process of, what are the steps involved? What are the different contributors to inflammation? How they may interact with each other with arrows. Some arrows are bidirectional, some only go in one direction. You get the idea that now all of a sudden there's a lot of information here, but as a learner, right, you can look at this and you can say, I can kind of see the bigger picture of all the things that may contribute to the inflammatory process, right? This would be an example of a concept map. And concept maps are great to review, right, as you're studying, if your instructor provides you one. But honestly, making them themselves, and especially as you get farther along in your studying, trying to make them from memory can be really effective, a really effective way to study, right? Because it's almost like, the strategy we talked about with active recall or retrieval practice, where you kind of just have the blank page and you dump everything you know about something, whatever you're trying to learn. I would do the same thing with creating a concept map. Get a blank page and start to sketch out all the different things that contribute and how they contribute, with explaining through linking verbs. This can be a great activity, right? Especially, again, when you see all the individual pieces, but if you're struggling to see the big picture of how they fit together, this concept mapping can be great. There are some software programs that'll help with concept mapping, kind of the actual, nuts and bolts of linking things and creating these nice, beautiful diagrams. CMap's one of them, is a really effective tool, free tool. But it can also be as simple as sketching it out on paper, or even in a PowerPoint file or something like that. Just kind of seeing how this different information may relate to each other. The last one I'll highlight is creating analogies. So again, we talked about one of the things in elaboration. When we learn something new, a lot of times what we want to do is see if we can link that to something we may already know, right? So it may be that you've taken a course already and then you're learning new information and you try to say, well, this information, how does it link to what I already know about this topic? Analogies kind of work the same way, right? We make use of something we're already familiar with. And then when we get new information, we may say, well, what does this remind me of? How can I link this to something I already know about? So there was a really interesting paper about from an instructor that teaches physiology, and they were explaining how they use an analogy of a city water supply system to explain the functioning of the blood supply to the body, right? And they talked about, the heart kind of serving as a pump, and the arteries serving as distribution pipes, and the arterioles as faucets, right? And so they took something students are already probably familiar with. They probably have a general understanding of faucets and pipes for taking water to their house, right? And they may see the pump, and they may see the water tower in town, right? If they have a water tower, so they get the idea. And then you could say, well, you already know how that works. Here's an analogy for each of those different things and how it relates to the different components of the cardiovascular system, right? So now all of a sudden our students, you're linking something you already know or you're familiar with something that you're trying to learn. In this case, he was using this analogy of the city's water supply system to teach students about the functioning of the cardiovascular system. So I think this can be really powerful in your own learning. So when you're studying, it can be helpful to say, okay, I've got a general idea of the different components and the different sources of information, the different concepts. Is there any analogy I can create, right? Because again, that's going to help you retain some of this information if you can link it to something you're already familiar with. And this is where we, again, want to get beyond just trying to remember isolated pieces of information, but trying to create more lasting memory frameworks that we can leverage, right? And I also think analogies can be effective because, when you get into exams, sometimes they can help you logic through some to get to a right answer, right? If you're taking an exam. So for instance, maybe you don't know the specific information if your instructor asks you a question, but if you have a good analogy you can lean on, you could say, well, this is how I conceptually think of the system. Can I use that information to at least use logic to get myself to a potential right answer, right? So I think that's another way where analogies can help us kind of use logic when we're in exam, even if we don't have the specific piece of information that the question may be asking about. So again, this is a really quick overview and a really superficial overview. But again, I think anything that you can do to kind of promote deeper processing of the information you're trying to learn is probably going to be good for your learning. And again, that's a big part of these kind of elaboration techniques. And so we think about like why elaboration is effective. And obviously we don't always really exactly know, but I think it comes down to how we kind of store information and how we retrieve information in our brain, right? We really don't store information as isolated pieces, right? Our brain kind of naturally creates these elaborate interconnected networks of information where we're constantly like linking related concepts, and we're creating frameworks of different concepts that relate to each other. So I think when we think of elaboration, we're really basically trying to learn in a manner that's can be conducive to better storage and retrieval. It's essentially trying to learn in a manner that is the way that our brain likes to process and store information naturally, right? So I think this is, in my mind, this is probably why these kind of elaboration techniques can be so effective, right? So again, elaboration strategies can help you kind of continuously dig deeper and see the bigger picture. And I think it's important for those who work in healthcare, right? Because the challenge with healthcare is you have to be able to see the bigger picture, right? When you can't just think about, okay, this is the system that's involved. I have to just focus on, this patient, and this is what is happening. You really have to see the big picture of, all these systems of the body kind of interact with each other and understand how that works, and again, see the bigger picture. But you also need to sometimes know the details, right? So it's almost like simultaneously trying to see the forest and the trees sometimes. And so I think this will allow you to develop that kind of really robust understanding and deep understanding that you're going to need to be successful moving forward.
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.